At this very moment 1 year ago, Hurricane Sandy was a monster storm just a few hours from colliding with the East Coast. Sandy was a devastating jolt, leaving behind dozens of fatalities, billions in damage, and tough questions that 1 year later we're still trying to answer. Within a 24-hour period, Hurricane Sandy had come and gone, hitting New Jersey and New York head-on with over 100-mile-per-hour winds. Entire neighborhoods were left decimated. New York City's subway system submerged. The New Jersey coastline a scene of apocalyptic destruction. While Massachusetts was spared the worst, individual communities like Plum Island suffered extensive damage. 5 months later, homeowners were just beginning to rebuild.
We are out here doing our best to save our homes. And it's something that I've always felt that we all had a right to do, whether it's on a barrier beach like this or whether it's on a tree-shaded street downtown.
But that desire to rebuild what we lost raises difficult questions about dealing with future storms. Just this weekend, Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty reopened to the public. They had been closed for the year as damage was repaired. That is, until the next storm hits. Joining me now, as she does every week, is WGBH science editor Heather Goldstone. Welcome.
Thank God to be here.
So, Heather, this last storm really changed the whole dialogue about global warming and climate change. You said Sandy was the one, because we had had such a severe winter before that, and a lot of freak storms. But after this one, it was like, that's it, the discussion's over.
Well, I wouldn't say the discussion's over.
I mean,
but
the debate over it.
It certainly changed the whole tenor of things. We are still doing a lot of rebuilding. There are still a lot of people talking about rebuilding. But if you think back to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, at that point, the rhetoric, if not the reality afterward, was rebuild, rebuild, rebuild. There was no other option. And now we're having a public dialogue where there is another option. We're seeing in New York hundreds of millions of dollars, and also in New Jersey, being poured into funds to actually buy out homeowners and turn those areas into permanent green spaces to have more resilient coastlines, and really starting to take to heart some of the warnings that we've been hearing from the scientific community for years, really, to say that it's not necessarily going to be sustainable to stay at the coast in the same way that we have for the past few decades.
And has that been effective? I mean, are people taking those buyouts?
Well, certainly in Staten Island, actually, the state of New York has more requests and more interests than they were prepared to handle. They have more neighborhoods that want to be bought out than they're actually ready to buy out. Because, of course, that is a costly way to deal with the problem. But it is a permanent solution, at least.
So, I mean, in terms of the next storm, you can never prepare for a hurricane. I can remember wicked hurricanes when I was a kid, so it seems like they're cyclical. But, I mean, are we saying that because of global warming, they're going to be worse? We're going to get hit harder? How does it affect it?
Well, certainly, I mean, we're not going to say that any one particular storm was caused by climate change. And as you said, there have always been hurricanes. The analogy that a lot of scientists use is that it's kind of like steroids in baseball. There's baseball even without steroids, but you see a few less home runs. In the case of Hurricane Sandy, this enormous, enormous storm and a little bit of its odd trajectory, there's some thought that it was probably juiced by climate change, you might say. It was made stronger and made a little bit different than it would have been otherwise. And I think in particular with the case of New York City, the fact that they got hit 2 years in a row with these major storms was really an eye-opener for them, and because it's such an iconic city for the nation, for the rest of the nation as well.
The other one being Hurricane Irene?
Yes, yes. And we also, we had Earl a year before that, and so it's just kind of been one after another up in the Northeast, and I think people are starting to realize that, it's not just about Florida or just about the Gulf Coast. This is the whole East Coast.
All right, well, my next guest has a personal and professional connection to the devastation caused by Superstorm Sandy. Kevin O'Connor is a New Jersey native. He spent his summers on the Jersey Shore and returned there recently as host of PBS's This Old House. Take a look.
No kidding. The water just kept rising. As a matter of fact, I had a kayak tied to the staircase here, tied up a banister up top so I can make my way out in case I needed to.
No kidding.
Electrical, plumbing, baseboard, insulation, floors, everything.
Everything's gone.
Was gone.
Huh.
So, Kevin, you really believe, you've been all up and down the shore now, and you have some great pictures that we're going to put up, but some of these homes are salvageable in a meaningful way.
Very much so. I mean, there's a big difference between a house that is subject to wave action, and that is literally the ocean smashing against it, and a house that is subject to rising water. And the numbers that we were looking at when we went to the Jersey coast were that something like 350,000 homes were damaged or destroyed by Sandy. But it's important to keep in mind that the vast majority of those homes were damaged by just rising water, flood water. And while that can be devastating and is devastating for a house, you would address that problem completely differently than you would address the problem of a house that's built on stilts right on the beach.
All right, so this is a couple of the pictures. This is a home that was damaged by rising water.
This is a home that was damaged by wave action. That house that you just saw right there was in Manilokan, and it was pushed off of the Barrier Island into the bay. That's a very different story than the homes that we dealt with, actually. We dealt with 3 houses on this old house, and they were all affected by rising water. And so there are different methodologies and different strategies if you're going to rebuild. And I think on this old house, that's what we were trying to address. If and when you decide that you're going to rebuild, what's the right way to do it so that you can withstand the next storm as best as possible?
I think we have a before and after of one of your homes. I'd like to see that and tell us what you did here.
One of the houses was in Manasquan. It was a very modest house. You can see it as a 1.5-story cape, and that took about 3 or 4 feet of water. And in this case, the homeowner, now she's about a mile or 2 away from the beach, so this wasn't wave action, this was rising water. And she decided that she wanted to stay and she wanted to rebuild. And so what we ended up doing was taking that house down completely and putting it back up on wooden pilings. They go about 20 feet into the ground and stick about 8 or 9 feet up above the ground. And then the new house was prefabricated, built off-site, and put on those. And so that this house, presumably now, is above the new floodplain and should be able to withstand any of that rising water in the future from future hurricanes.
Did her insurance pay for that?
Her insurance paid for some of that. She was in a situation, it's a very modest house. She's a single woman, oncology nurse. She had just finished paying off her mortgage, had just finished a renovation to her house prior to Sandy striking. So it was a financial burden for her. She did receive some assistance to help rebuild that house.
Well, we've seen this, of course, Heather, on Plum Island and other places on the Cape where you reside, and you were just talking about Staten Island. I mean, some of those communities, they feel it's because of the sea level issue as well that they think it's not worth it?
You know, I think basically what a lot of the experts have been telling us for years is not necessarily that we have to abandon the coastlines completely, but that we need to have some of these discussions that we're starting to have and make some of these hard choices, that in some cases it is going to be worth rebuilding or at least upgrading and putting something on stilts. At the Cape Cod National Seashore, they're having to rebuild one of their bathhouses, and part of the plan is to actually make it mobile so that it's easy to pick it up and move it back from the beach when that becomes necessary. So there are ways to stay at the coast, but those also cost money, and so there just needs to be this conversation about how much money it's worth to stay at the coast, how we do that in a smart way, and then when we do decide to retreat.
How did you decide who you were going to help, Kevin? My gosh.
Well, there was no shortage of them. We found 3 compelling stories that had 3 different types of damage and 3 different solutions. There was no end to the list. And here's the amazing thing. When people talk about retreating from the coast, we definitely have to think about that. But the reality is that we're there. In New Jersey alone, there are 4 coastal communities that were hardest hit by Sandy. There's 1.5 million people that live in those counties. That's more people that live in the entire state of New Hampshire, Vermont, 9 other states in this country. So it's easy to sort of think about, oh, well, what if we just move away? We can't. It's not just those 1.5 million people, but it's the infrastructure, it's the businesses, it's the schools. They are there. And so it's a balanced discussion, I think, about sort of where do we retreat, but more importantly, when we don't, how do we build to prevent further damage like this?
I know it's still a lot of damaged property there. Kevin O'Connor, thanks so much. Heather Goldstone.
My pleasure.